Won't you please welcome Dr. Steven Bonta.
It's an honor to be here. My talk, alas, is what the esteemed Robert Welch used to refer to as an intellectual cigarette break. In those halcyon days before smoking tobacco was not illegal, the title is A New Raj. The term Raj has to do with a long ago period when Britannia ruled the waves, when the British Empire engirded the entire earth, when the sun never set, and the crown jewel of that great empire, that prodigy of the entire age, was British India, and what's now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and that part of the world. And it was called the Raj, the word Raj coming from a Sanskrit word meaning king, or a derived form kingdom. I thought I would give you a short perspective on how the British Empire in general and the Raj, which was its most important part, certainly, its biggest source of revenue, came to be, and compare it with the American experience, or perhaps what we may extrapolate the American experience may become if we persist on the path that we are following. The Raj itself, the empire really started, at least the empire minus the American portion, started in the mid-1700s and followed a very, very sharp trajectory upward. It reached its apogee in the Victorian period and then collapsed very ignominiously in the mid-20th century, very suddenly. It's remarkable to think that circa 1900, no person alive, except perhaps a very few, could have possibly imagined that the day would come when Great Britain wasn't the dominant power in the whole world, when all nations would not do obeisance to her. But in point of fact, within less than a human lifetime after that, it was so. Now, when the British arrived in the early 1600s, the peoples of the Indian subcontinent were already accustomed to imperial dominion. They had been under the heel, most of India, at any rate, had been under the heel of what was called the Mughal Empire. And it sounds a little bit like the word Mongol for a reason. The Mughals were Mongol, Turkic peoples out of Central Asia. They were akin to the Huns, not the Huns, but the Mongols, the Tartars, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, and all that crowd. A portion of them had come down and basically turned most of India into part of their empire, which reached its apogee under a man named Aurangzeb in the early 1600s, and then declined very rapidly thereafter, was quickly eclipsed by another empire, the Maratha Empire, which was run primarily by Indians. But by the mid-1700s, the British were in a position, they had by then been in India for over 100 years. They started as a corporate power, the so-called East India Corporation. Now, it is a corporation, but there were many differences between what we understand corporations to be. Well, perhaps not so many in this day and age. But the British East India Corporation, which was formed in the year 1600, was chartered by the Crown as an exclusive monopoly over all trade with the Far East, India, but also the East Indies, anywhere that the English could get a foothold. And it was established ostensibly for economic purposes. And so before very long, it had its own security forces, its own military, and so forth. And by the mid-1700s, with the collapse of the Mughals, there was something of a power vacuum in India, and various factions were fighting for control. And there occurred a battle in 1757 near modern-day Calcutta, in which the forces of the British East India Company, led by a man, a very ambitious fellow, an insider of his day by the name of Robert Clive, who became immensely wealthy as a result of his connections in the Far East, utterly vanquished the forces of the local Nizam, or leader, and overthrew the power in what was the area known as Bengal, where the people speak Bengali, the Bengali language, which coincides with modern-day Bangladesh and also West Bengal in India. Very, very hot, steamy, malaria-infested part of the world. But nevertheless, it was a beginning. And so with the overthrow of the local Nawab, then the British, for the first time, basically commenced political control of India, and it sort of went from there over the next 50 years, 60 years, at the precise time that the British were fighting us in the War of Independence, fighting the French later on in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting the French in the 7 Years' War, and so forth. During that whole period when they were engaged in almost incessant warfare in Europe and the Western Hemisphere, they were also fighting a long series of wars in the Far East. They were very much a power at that time capable of fighting simultaneous major conflicts on all parts of the world. And the first series was the so-called Mysore Wars. They decided that it wasn't enough. Mysore has nothing to do with the disease. It's actually a kingdom, was a very powerful kingdom in the Deccan Plateau in southern India. And it took 4 wars to subdue them, the last of which ended in 1799 or thereabouts. The third one was the crucial one. It ended in 1792, I believe. But the person who was in charge of British forces was none other than good old General Charles Cornwallis, lately of Yorktown, who was smarting at that defeat and wanted a chance at redemption. So he went all the way over to the other side of the world. He was appointed the second Governor General, basically the supreme authority over British India. He was the one responsible for subduing this huge portion of southern India. And then at the same time, they launched a series of wars against the empire of the Marathas, which controlled all of central and northern India. And finally, about 1819, right about the time when the Napoleonic Wars were winding down finally in Europe, they vanquished the kingdom of the Marathan Empire and took over that part. So with the end of that, by 1820, the British were effectively in charge of almost all of the Indian subcontinent. Now, I hasten to add that there were some areas like Nepal and Bhutan, both in the Himalayas, that were never completely subdued by the British. So they didn't have complete control over the area. Also, Ceylon, the island now known as Sri Lanka, was a British colony as well, but under a separate colonial authority. And there was the ever-fluctuating northwest frontier, nowadays known as the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan and into Afghanistan, where the British began, starting in 1842 or thereabouts, decided that they had to go up and take Central Asia too, lest the Russians get to it first. And this ended, of course, in the ignominious defeat in the First Afghan War. There were several others, the last of which was 1919. Suffice it to say that the period often known as the Pax Britannica, the British peace, in which it is alleged the entire world was at peace because of the puissance of the dreadnoughts of Her Majesty's navies and armies, was a figment of historians and propagandists' imaginations. I recently read a new history of British India by John Kay, and he says that there was not a single year during that whole period from basically of 100 years, from 1820 to the end of World War, well, no, almost 100 years. It usually ends with World War I, when Britain was not at war somewhere in the world with one of their possessions to be. So it was a period, if not in India, then elsewhere, characterized by constant warfare. Of course, in India, the worst time was 1857. The mutiny was the time when the Indians very nearly, the insurgents, if you will, almost overthrew their colonial masters. And so brutal was the British suppression of that mutiny and their final victory at Gwalior that basically India was pacified for the next several decades at least, although by the late 1800s, they were ready to start agitating for independence again. And right after World War I, the infamous Amritsar massacre, in which the British basically rove into Amritsar, the holy city of the Punjab, and massacred hundreds and hundreds of women and children and other innocent demonstrators, just machine-gunned them at will, pretty much convinced the world that there was nothing benign about the Raj or the British Empire. So the end result was that Britain was forced, after generations of maintaining that they were in India and other parts of their empire for their own good, that they were this great civilizing influence, that the empire was a source of bounty and good, that it was the wonder of the age, that it was the will of God, that the British crown was approved by God for what it did. After all of this, the usual excuses were exhausted. Finally, they were forced to abandon in a great hurry their possessions in India and elsewhere in the world in a very few years after the Second World War, being bankrupt and exhausted. That was what happened. And of course, today, they are little more than a rump of American interests worldwide. So, the British Empire did not last very long. 195 years was the total duration of the Raj. Now, what is the point of all this? Why bring it up at all? Well, for one thing, it was asked of me when Arts proposed this talk, wanted to know whether there was any possibility that the mistakes of the British could be repeated in that part of the world. For example, in Pakistan, and of course very conspicuously in Afghanistan, we are now there. We have garrisoned Afghanistan and also all of those other countries in Central Asia that formerly were Soviet possessions and now, in effect, become our own protectorates. And so it's tempting to conclude that we're going in the same direction. And I would maintain that we are, although it doesn't seem likely that we're going to conquer India anytime soon, since India has been wise enough to build a nuclear arsenal. The justifications that we hear are similar. We often hear, for example, that U.S. imperialism is justified on economic terms, that if we are using our military force discreetly to run roughshod over non-domesticated regimes, to prize open doors by force so that we can trade, or if we go into Iraq, of course, that we will be repaid many times over with oil revenues for our troubles. The economic arguments are invoked, just as they were in the days of the Raj, the British Empire. But the truth of the matter is that the Raj was a drain, a constant drain on British assets. Here's what this historian Kay had to say about it. He said, "The order and stability which British rule undeniably brought did not come cheap. In the opinion of most Indians, Pax Britannica meant mainly Tax Britannica, which is to say that the British looted the subcontinent for what they could get. They taxed the inhabitants heavily. They logged most of the valuable forests away. They basically took and looted what they could get and left the natives with very little. And even there, the benefits accrued were not accrued by the people of Great Britain. There was no Pax Britannica dividend of any sort. Such progress as Britain made, particularly in the 19th century, was made because of things like the repeal of the Corn Laws and other legislative reforms and obviously reform of property laws and so forth, in which they moved from the stratified social and legal system of the Middle Ages and the early modern era into a country where it became more possible for people to make money and for people to move from one class to another. It did not come about emphatically because of their colonial proclivities. Just as we are discovering to our dismay, there has been no economic benefit to our occupation of Iraq or Afghanistan. And as time goes on and we become increasingly aware of the fact that our leaders have no intention of ever extracting us from there or from Yugoslavia, which we garrisoned early last decade, or Afghanistan, the excuses continue to evolve, but it's becoming very clear what the reality is. It's very obvious that there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington, just as there was a long time ago in Great Britain, that whatever we do, we can't change the status quo. We can argue about cosmetic matters, but we certainly can't think about rolling back our imperial gains. But the reality is that the British Empire had very little to do with prosperity. It served to enrich very few, and of course, it also enabled certain people, Robert Clive among them, the victor at Plassey, and Warren Hastings is another example, a man who was the first Governor General of India. These men went away, ordinary bureaucrats, soldiers, administrators, etc., came back from India, very wealthy men. But did their countrymen see any of the benefits? No, they didn't. And of course, the Indians didn't either. But in any case, another thing that is often ascribed to the so-called enlightened empire of the British and a basis for comparison with our own activities is this. We need to civilize these people. Today, we talk about civilizing the world in the name of democracy. I mean, bureaucracy, there you go. That was a Freudian slip if ever there was one. But believe me, the Indians we can't teach them anything about bureaucracy. The notion that was bruited about the British Empire starting in the early 19th century was that, we've been there for commercial interests, but it's time we start acting like the civilizing saviors that we ought to be. And a man named William Bentinck was appointed Governor General. He was a very, very devout Christian, and he felt that as long as we're there, what we need to do is just send all the Christian missionaries there, civilize them, teach them our laws, teach them our ways, and so forth and so on. And so under Bentinck's administration, they did this. And to be sure, there were some benefits. For example, the suppression of Thuggee, the cult of the thugs, was accomplished during his time in office. So there were some benefits, but as with all such questions, one need ask, okay, but what was the reverse side of it? Well, first of all, the Christianizing mission didn't really work in India or Pakistan. The Hindus and Muslims really did not convert en masse. There wasn't a great evangelical revival moment. There are today about, there's some tens of millions of Christians in India, a very substantial number, but a very small percentage of the actual population, likewise in Pakistan. But in any event, when the empire came to an end, it did so in such a messy fashion that it undid any of the good that the British might have accomplished there. Of course, this is the very thing that people are worried about now in Iraq. If we pull out, what'll happen? Now they've become our responsibility. Well, the British found out there was no easy way to do it. And when they finally did withdraw from India right after World War II, they did so under conditions of absolute chaos, in spite of the efforts of Mohandas Gandhi to have a single Indian state, which, by the way, had never in all of history existed. The Muslims insisted that they were going to have their own state, and so civil war was the result. In 1848, there was an absolutely apocalyptic slaughter that took place as most of the Hindus who lived in what was to become Pakistan, the Muslim part of India, fled on foot into India, and many Muslims left India to go to Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, East Pakistan now being Bangladesh. That's what happens when you go in, play empire for a couple of hundred years, and then pull out. Now, if you contrast the experience of those portions of the world that were civilized and enlightened and kept under the benign overseership of the British with those few parts of Asia that escaped such overseership, the contrast is really quite striking. Both Nepal and Bhutan are in the latter category. So the point being is that if you contrast the histories of those areas that weren't interfered with, you see that in the long run, a lot of lives were saved and a lot of fortunes spared. If you go to Southeast Asia, which was primarily under the sway of Great Britain and also the French, well, what's the only country in Southeast Asia, leaving aside the city-state of Singapore, of mainland Southeast Asia that's had a nice, peaceful history, except for the occasional coup d'etat? Thailand. Yeah, Thailand. How many wars have they fought? None, basically. They've been the ones that set up the refugee camps and the hospital tents for all the casualties of the wars being fought in all the countries around them. But Thailand somehow knew how to govern its own affairs. Another man who experienced the British Empire firsthand was Rudyard Kipling. You all know him. He was the first English speaker to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1908. He was an Anglo-Indian, meaning he was born in India, in Bombay, as a matter of fact, although he did not live there long, but he came back later in life. And he's chiefly known for his stories about India, stories and poems and so forth. The Jungle Book, for example, Plain Tales from the Hills, the novel Kim, and many other things. He had a tremendous gift for words, but his attitude regarding the empire underwent a certain transformation. At the beginning, he was very pro-empire. He thought it was a wonderful idea. But as he grew older and wiser and more observant in the affairs of men, as men of letters are wont to do, he refined his viewpoint. And in 1892, he was asked, 1897, he was asked to prepare a poem at the occasion of the Diamond Jubilee, which means the 60th anniversary, by the way, not the 50th anniversary or 75th. The Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, who was then, and unless Queen Elizabeth lives until 2016, is so far the longest reigning monarch in English history. And at this Diamond Jubilee, it was expected that he would produce something worthy of the occasion, namely some sort of paean hymn of praise to the glories of the empire. And what he came up with was something rather unexpected, and it did rub a lot of people the wrong way. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's a poem turned into a hymn called Recessional. It may be familiar to some of you. I quote in part. It's a poignant warning of the dangers of imperial hubris. He wrote this: God of our fathers known of old, Lord of our far-flung battle line, beneath whose awful hand we hold dominion over palm and pine, Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. The tumult and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings depart. Still stands thine ancient sacrifice, an humble and a contrite heart. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. And now here comes the part that got people upset. Far called, our navies melt away, on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget. If, drunk with sight of power, we loose wild tongues that have not thee in awe, such boasting as the Gentiles use, or lesser breeds without the law. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. For heathen heart that puts her trust in reeking tube and iron shard, all valiant dust that builds on dust and guarding calls not thee to guard. For frantic boast and foolish word, thy mercy on thy people, Lord. Now, when he wrote those words, again, scarcely a person who listened to them could have imagined that a generation or so later, these prophetic words would have come to pass. The essence of this poem is this, that the impulses that lead man to rely upon what we might call the arm of the flesh, these are not impulses worthy of Christian men and women, not worthy of truly civilized people. I think that's a fair paraphrasis of what Kipling was trying to say. And he went on to say, not only that, these things are ephemeral. They are temporary. One of the last great poems that he wrote in his life, which I'm not going to read in full, but I recommend, is known as The Gods of the Copybook Headings. He wrote it near the end of his life. After his own son had died in World War I, he came to realize the full folly of this sort of thing, of the fighting what he called savage wars for peace. He became somewhat bitter, if the literary evidence is any indication. And he said, in effect, the gods of the copybook headings were a metaphor for the immutable laws of human behavior, economics, history, and so forth, that govern the affairs of men in the long run. And the poem says that the whole course of human progress seems to consist of constant efforts to deny the reality of these laws, to get something for nothing, for example. He makes mention of that. To controvert the ways of nature. And then in the end, the gods of the copybook headings rise up and have their say. And then empires fall. As he puts it, they return with terror and slaughter, which is perhaps a little bit strong, but it's true. Certainly the Romans discovered that. The British end was a bit milder than Rome, but it was an end nonetheless. Now, my friends, we don't know to what end our path might take us, unless, as was mentioned earlier this evening, we make the choice to take control of our destiny. See, right now, we don't control what's happening to our country. We are being led just as the British were led, and yet we suppose that we will be the first who will somehow evade the long-term consequences of this sort of behavior. And in every case, if you examine the historical record closely, you will find that in no instance did these things happen by accident. That in every case, they were guided and manipulated by cabals, by groups of self-serving individuals who wanted to enrich and empower themselves at the expense of everyone else. Certain people seem to have a knack for that. This is what is happening to our country right now. The worst thing of all about empire is that we lose control of our own destiny. We become hostage to forces that we cannot control. We become, for example, now that we've chosen to occupy Iraq, well, suddenly Iran is this big threat, and you get carried to the point where you no longer have control over when you're going to fight a war, or over economic matters, of course. These are the hidden costs of empire. And perhaps the greatest danger, as I see it, is the danger that people are seduced through pride to believe that this is our destiny, that we can't turn away now, that we have to step into the shoes of the British and all these other powers that went before us, that we have no choice, that the world cannot possibly function of its own accord without our benign overseership. All of these are lies, in my view, satanic lies, because they're going to lead us very swiftly down the same road that Great Britain and others have followed, unless we decide to take back control of our country, which means, of course, control of our government and our economy and all the rest. You see, there's a reason why they called that organization the Council on Foreign Relations, because foreign relations are the most remote thing from any of us. They're the hardest for us to control. They're the thing that most of us are least likely to be concerned with. But withal, through the power of treaties and other commitments, they are one of the easiest ways to subvert the body politic of a country, is to seize control of its relations with other countries and then divert them toward different ends. This is what has taken place. It happened with the British, and it will happen to us. What do we need to do? Well, We need to find a way to take back control of our government, to understand, and I would say that we need to inform ourselves fully about foreign policy, about what we're really doing in all those 135 countries or wherever it is that we have troops, and so forth and so on. What are we actually doing? What's our purpose there? And what is the long-term goal? It's not happening by accident, but we are being taken where we would not go if we could but see what destiny has in store for us. I assure you that the time is very late, but it is not too late to change. If we do so, it will be an historic first. But this country traffics in historic firsts, does it not? Okay? This country has achieved many historic firsts. And I believe in my heart that the day will come when we will, of our own accord, we will choose to forsake the path that we're followed before we're forced to do it by the gods of the copybook headings. It is my prayer and hope that we in the John Birch Society and everyone else in this room, whether you belong to the Birch Society or not, that you are committed to this cause of restoring not only proper constitutional government, but also proper foreign policy, proper humility, and proper vision of us. Let us return to the restraint of Washington and Jefferson and seek once more to be a shining city on the hill for the world to see, not a wrathful military colossus for all the world to fear. Let us put our trust in God rather than in the arm of the flesh, lest we forget. Thank you very much.